Hey viewers, welcome to another REIT Forum video. This time we're covering the Realty Income Q2 2025 earnings. This is going to be a pretty short video because there isn't much to say. As a net lease REIT, the results for Realty Income are usually pretty predictable. This quarter was not an exception. AFFO per share came in at $1.05. That matched the estimate. Guidance went up from $4.25 to $4.26 at the midpoint. It's a tiny increase, but any increase is positive. Since the consensus estimate was also $4.25, that also beats the consensus estimate, so that looks pretty good for them. When we get into the results, I'm going to scroll down a bit. We can see that the consensus estimate for FFO was $1.06. Some sites are going to proceed to run with that number and then try to compare AFFO per share to the consensus estimate for FFO. It seems to happen every quarter, so I just want readers to be aware that that's going to happen. When we look at the guidance, we can see that little increase here. This isn't a huge growth rate year over year, but still, it's not bad. The dividend is very thoroughly covered, no concerns there. Since Realty Income is using net lease contracts on their properties, they have their cash flow locked in several years in advance. That makes it much easier for them to ensure that they will have that steady dividend coverage, even if there are economic disruptions. When we look at the biggest issues for Realty Income, the first thing is that they have a few weak tenants. That's the factor that's impacting them more than it's impacting some of the other net lease REITs. And then we have the challenge just that interest rates increased a few years ago. They are still high relative to where they were for a very, very long time. So that could create a bit of a headwind as debts expire and they end up needing to refinance. However, the borrowing in euros has been pretty effective as a way to reduce the rate on their debts. So that's good. I'm going to scroll down again. We've got the guidance slide because some people just want to be able to see it. So I pulled it out. You can see these top numbers. These don't actually matter. They're at the top, which is very normal. The reason they're in this order is because they're starting with net income per share and then they're showing the adjustments that are necessary to reach AFFO per share. Obviously, they're not going to be showing everything as individual line items. So we just have this line called other adjustments per share, and they wrapped a lot of stuff in there, but it's fine. Same store rent growth, no change. Most of this stuff, no change until we get down to investment volume. That increased by $1 billion. Given Realty Income size, that's not a really big difference. That's also probably going to be weighted towards the end of the year, so it's not going to have a big impact this year. It's not even going to be that big of an impact next year because an extra $1 billion in investments for Realty Income just isn't that much. All right, we're going to close out of this and go down. So, the big story that some investors will be seeing over the last few years is that Realty Income is regularly issuing shares. During the quarter, they were using a forward agreement. That's how they lock in the price for issuing shares in the future. They don't want to just issue the share today when they don't intend to buy the real estate for several months. They want to lock in the price because they are also negotiating for the price on the real estate, and they want to ensure that when they issue those shares, their weighted average cost of capital, which includes the cost of equity and the cost of debt, they need to make sure that that's going to be materially lower than the cap rate on the properties they're trying to buy, because that's how they get that accretive impact where each purchase is helping them to increase AFFO per share. And that's a pretty big part of how net lease REITs grow their AFFO per share. The rent escalators on their contracts are typically only around 1% or at most 2%. There are some scenarios where when CPI, that's the Consumer Price Index, when that soars, they'll end up with a higher rate for increasing. But for the most part, they're just looking at increasing around 1% per year. So the additional growth is a function of being able to issue some additional shares and buying more real estate and having a spread between the rate that they're buying the real estate at and their cost of capital. I'm going to scroll down to get the next table up. So this is the table that we use to help investors make sense of what's going on. You could see here that the weighted average shares have increased substantially. But when we go over to the AFFO per share, we still have a respectable growth rate there. It's not massive. This isn't a very easy climate for any REIT to deliver growth in, at least any REIT that has a material amount of debt. And net lease REITs do carry a material amount of debt. Because their leases are locked in for so many years in advance, they don't need to keep debt as low as some of the other REITs would. If you know what most of your cash flows are for the next 10 years, you can use a little bit more leverage without it becoming a big problem. That's also why Realty Income is able to maintain such an excellent credit rating. All right, we're going to close this. We're going to go down a little bit. So, the earnings call is going on right now. When I finished the article, that was still a little bit before the earnings call, but I had to put this together pretty fast. I had to do a lot of prep work before it came out. Then we've got this slide. This is from Ticker. This is just so that we could show investors the consensus estimates for the upcoming years, and we could show them the historical performance. So you could see FFO per share has a pretty nice growth rate. Now, there are some years where it grew faster. Going into 2021, it jumped quite a bit, and then going into 2022, it absolutely surged. And the reason it was able to jump so much going into 2022 is Realty Income had a very low weighted average cost of capital, but they could still get some pretty attractive deals on purchasing real estate. Because their cost of capital was so low, and they were still able to get similar deals when they were purchasing real estate, they were able to get a bigger spread between their cost of capital and the rate on those acquisitions. That enabled them to accelerate their growth in AFFO per share. Okay, we're going to close that. We're going down. Now I've got just a few general notes. This is from the top of their earnings release. I just wanted to highlight a few things for people, make it a little bit easier in case you're not used to reading the earnings releases. So it matches the estimate on AFFO per share. That's nice. The initial weighted average cash yield is 7.2%. That's good. We know that exceeds the cost of capital. How? Well, the cost of their debt capital is 3 point something percent. We don't need to be very precise right now because it's about to get really easy. The AFFO yield on their equity, that's going to be more like 7.3% or so. So if you average a number around 7.3% with a number in the 3% range, that's going to end up giving you something that is well under 7.2%. I just checked and confirmed. The share price currently is $56.91. That is an AFFO yield of 7.3%. And since they finance a material part of their company, using our spreadsheets, it's about 34% of the company was financed through debt. Well, if you give the debt at under 4%, a 34% weight, and the equity a 66% weight at 7.3%, that's going to give you an average that's lower than 7.2%. Pretty easy math. Now I've got the multiple here. It's 5.5 times for net debt to their adjusted EBITDA. That's fine. Their net lease rate, that's pretty typical for what you would expect from them. There are some that run higher on leverage. Those generally aren't as good. There are some that run lower on leverage, like Agree Realty. They typically run a bit lower on this metric. All right, here we could see the ATM program was used for the forward sale agreements. That's just how they are financing buying new real estate. They can't buy $5 billion of new real estate without issuing shares or issuing debt. That doesn't work. They don't just have $5 billion sitting around. For some reason, there are always some bad investors who think that that's how business is supposed to work. It's not. Clearly, they've never invested in real estate. Okay, we have some funds left under the ATM program. These are forward sales that have yet to settle. And finally, we could see that they were issuing some debt and they were getting rates below 4% on the new issuance. That's because they were using euros to issue the debt. Rates are lower in the EU, and that allows Realty Income to get that debt at a lower rate. Since they also own real estate in the EU, that's fine. There's not a big currency mismatch like you would have if the REIT only owned real estate in the United States and then tried to use debt in euros. All right, thank you for reading. Please remember, hit the thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, show us your appreciation. Have a good night.